Welcome to the Essentially You podcast, Dr. Felice Gersh. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining me and having this wonderful conversation.
Oh my gosh, I am so excited to be talking about really menopause, but specifically your book as well, and why women must go through menopause. And the reason why I love the idea of us having this conversation is that so many women are not necessarily looking forward to menopause and to what's on the other side. And I know a big part of the conversation that we have here on the podcast is not only are we going through it, we're doing it, right? As we do everything and anything, but we also get to do it on our own terms. And I think what allows us to do it on our own terms, and Dr. Felice Gersh, I'm really excited to have you speak into this, is that really the knowing of what's going to happen. I feel like we didn't know what was going to happen. And I know that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today.
Absolutely. It's a journey every single woman will encounter and deal with, because it's part of the life journey of every woman. So it is something that needs to come out into the light of day, be talked about, and then allow each woman to be prepared and then to optimize her health through the journey and thereafter.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would love to first kind of talk a little bit about your inspiration around why wanting to write this book and why wanting to serve women for all these years as a practitioner.
Well, when I was going through medical school, I had to decide, like every other doctor, well, what am I going to specialize in? Or am I going to just be a GP? Well, when I rotated through obstetrics and gynecology, my first rotation through that as a third-year medical student, I knew instantly, this is for me. I love the excitement, the adrenaline rushes that you get when you go in to do a delivery. And of course, sometimes it could be life and death. Women can have hypertensive crises, they could have hemorrhage, the baby can fly out, you could have triplets, so there's like so much that can happen where you really have to make split-second decisions. And I kind of fed off of the adrenaline rush and the variety that you do surgery, and then you can also have long-term relationships with patients, that it's not just like a surgeon, you do one surgery and then you're done, you just never see that person again. You can have a lifetime relationship with your patients when you do OB-GYN. So it seemed to have it all. And on top of that, it was dealing with women. And I myself was dealing with female issues because I wasn't having regular cycles. I couldn't get rid of my acne. And I felt that I was getting nowhere. No one was helping me. So it's one of those, like it covers all bases. A lot of people go into fields that deal with problems their family members have been facing or they themselves. So I had, everything was all together for me for OB-GYN. It was dealing with all these really interesting women at every stage of life with all kinds of issues, surgery, deliveries, and regular medical care. And I was going to figure out what was going on with me.
Yes. And so let's talk a little bit about what was going on with you and kind of how you were able to figure that out. It sounds to me like it was potentially polycystic ovarian syndrome.
It was, right? No periods and acne and like the stray facial hair. It's like, what is this? And I was very, very thin at that time. Now I'm sort of like regular, I have to say, but then I was like super thin. So I didn't meet the typical look of women with PCOS, which was typically overweight or even obese. So when I went to get care at the healthcare center for women at my college, they just said the same as everyone says, go on birth control pills. And then I went and saw one of the hotshot doctors when I was in medical school in the department. And he said the same thing, just go on birth.
He did.
And he said, just go on birth control pills. And, like you'll worry about it when you want to get pregnant. And it's like, but they make me feel like I want to throw up all day long. I didn't like the feel of it. It gave me headaches. And I kept saying, but something is wrong with me. Don't you even care? And like, I didn't have a period for 2 years at that point when I went in medical school, and like, nobody cared. It was like, what is wrong with me? I mean, what is happening? And I had to go figure it all out myself. And then that's why I went down the route of sort of helping women with PCOS. And then it really also, as I aged into menopause myself. Of course, every stage of woman's life, going through puberty and then reproductive issues, and of course, then the transition into menopause and thereafter. Every one of them held a tremendous interest for me, and I got to go through all of them myself. And, and I never knew that I had such a low pain threshold until I had my first baby either. So I got to appreciate what labor is like. So there's nothing like going through things yourself, and you can have this real identification with your patients and what they're going through. And I try to cover it all. And menopause is of course, universal event for every woman. And the average age in the United States is between 50, 51, some they say between 50 and 52. I myself, once again, was not normal. So I had what would be called an early menopause. At age 43, I was fully in menopause, and it's like, not me, not now, I'm not ready for this. And so I had to really do a deep dive into that as well. Like, why is this happening and what can I do? So I wanted to share my own knowledge, my own investigation. So I define myself as a synthesizer. So I read widely through every type of scientific and medical literature to learn the basic science, what's going on. And then I try to look at all the different organ systems, so I read through cardiovascular, science and the neurology literature. So I look at it all because everything applies to women in some fashion. And then I try to synthesize it into a cohesive whole that can then be pragmatically and practically and effectively applied to clinical practice. So looking at how you can convert basic science knowledge, research on things like mice and so on, and then see how that can apply to the actual care of humans. Because unfortunately, may be aware of this, and the readers may not, the viewers, that up until 2015, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, did not require that women be in any studies that, except obviously if it's a female specific problem, obviously it has to be women, but like pregnancy. But otherwise, no, you don't have to include women. And that includes animal studies. Like even the rats and the mice studies didn't include female mice and rats. So we have like limited data. So sometimes we have to look, and extrapolate from what has been studied because we don't have the data on women. Many of the drugs that are so commonly used, all the data was obtained in men. So I try to synthesize all this to put something together for women. And menopause is probably the most fascinating topic because it basically incorporates something happening in every organ system of the body. And it is fascinating. And the initial topic that you brought up of like, why is this that women have to go through this? I actually posed that question to myself. It's like, Mother Nature, why did you do this? Like, did this have to happen? Like a big question, like, why does this have to happen to women and what is happening? And the word menopause itself, it's a kind of lovely word when you think it's like meno, it's from the Greek for moon, that's kind of romantic sounding. And then pause, well, it's not really a pause, like a momentary pause. It's like a permanent pause. So they could call it menostop, but they called it menopause. But it's really the end of the beautiful lunar cycles of women, which incorporate way more than just the end of having periods. And that's not always very clear to women. They think, oh, yay, I don't have to have a period, but they're not really thinking about what you might call the collateral damage that occurs, that comes along for the ride, which is really massive, unfortunately. And that's why preparing for menopause, just like I know we were talking before about, you had a beautiful baby about a year ago. Well, I'm very big on advocating for health to be achieved prior to conception. So preconceptual health. Well, we need to have pre-menopausal health, So the health of the woman through her life is really what creates her health savings account, that's going to impact really how she's going to handle in every respect, in every aspect, how menopause is going to affect her body and how she's going to be able to deal with it. So, every woman, no matter how old you are out there, you are preparing for menopause.
Yes, you are. And I feel like we really get a taste of that. We're speaking into, I had my baby at 41 and I already knew I was showing signs of perimenopause. That happened to me in my late 30s. And so, really, we get a good glimpse. I would say a 10 plus year glimpse into what menopause can hold for us as we navigate that transitional period into perimenopause. It kind of likens to the 12 years it takes to go through puberty. We ramp into reproductive age, and it takes a minute because, as you and I both know, it is a energetic process to be able to conceive and grow a baby and then birth a baby. Like, no wonder it takes us so long to get to that place. And then, no surprise, it's going to take a minute for us to pivot into menopause as well. And so I think you're absolutely right. Like, how do we prepare our bodies? And so I think a lot of women, you're like you said, kind of were told that they're just going to this proverbial moment in time where in their cycling phase, their follicular and luteal phase of reproduction, and then one day, bam, they're just not. There's a lot more in between, and there's a lot more that we can do to prepare to really get our bodies ready. Because as you mentioned, menopause isn't just a state of our reproductive system deciding that, you know what, we're done here. It is neurological, it is metabolic, it is cardiovascular, it is immune system driven, all of these changes, it's mood. And the more that we can really love up on our body, it's what I really want to talk about today, we can gear up for that pretty important transition in our life that, like you said, if we're not prepared for, it can really feel like the wheels fall off.
Absolutely. It's so important now for every woman to really grasp what's happening, that menopause, it gives the wrong idea. And you just touched on it, that it's a process. It's not like you hit a finish line and, oh, I just crossed it. And no, it's a process. And what it really should be renamed is something like, ovarian senescence. It's really about the ovaries. It's the story of the ovaries and their aging and their loss of capability of making these critical hormones, estradiol, which is the estrogen from the ovaries, and progesterone. And testosterone is not really directly, there's definitely impact on testosterone, but testosterone has sort of a life of its own. And so it can be continued to be made well through the rest of the life, but definitely through the 60s.
Yeah, but I rarely see that. I rarely see that in labs. Oftentimes I find women's testosterone levels are way lower than we'd anticipate early on.
Nature designs testosterone to go down. You keep making it, whereas the ovaries completely cease to make even a drop of estrogen and progesterone. But testosterone, by the average woman by age 40, is making half the testosterone from her ovaries that she made at age 20. So definitely there's a downward trajectory for testosterone, and just more stuff that women have to deal with that they need to be aware of so that they can take proactive steps, to deal with the consequences. And the consequences of this gradual, which it's a gradual, and it kind of parallels the decline of fertility, the decline of ovarian function, because when fertility goes down, like for women typically, like certainly in their 40s over 35, they can still have perfectly regular cycles. So you think, well, they're still having regular cycles. Why is their fertility going down? Because the egg quality is going down. And it's really important. We now know, of course, male sperm matter too. So the quality goes down, and then you make a different quality embryo, and then the embryo may not successfully be able to implant, and won't take hold, and it won't grow, and so forth. And of course, this decline in reproductive success and fertility is paralleled with ovarian function. So it's really a process, and that's why the aging process is really occurring, and then accelerates as women get into the last 5 years and even 10 years before the last menstrual cycle occurs. And it's an arbitrary definition of menopause, which is, 12 months without a spontaneous period. And that's an arbitrary definition. I mean, why couldn't it be 6 months. Why couldn't it be 15 months? These are made up definitions. So once you understand that even after ovulation stops and you're not having cycles, you're still making some estrogen from your ovaries, but you're not ovulating. And then eventually that goes away. And we never know the moment when estrogen is completely no longer made. And so, but it's a process of ovarian aging, declining functionality, declining quality of the eggs, number of eggs, and so on. And it's nature's plan. I mean, that's what we have to understand, because it's a philosophical thing and it's also a natural thing, a biological thing. So we can approach it from many different ways of thinking, like, why is this happening to women 100% of the time? And there's certain things that we can do to delay menopause, but not by a lot, by a little bit. We can eat more vegetables. We can take like DHEA, we can take some melatonin that we do for fertility. You can have PRP injected into your ovaries, and that will do a little bit of rejuvenation. But we know the best we can do is improve fertility in the later stages of the fertile ability of women, and also delay menopause a tiny bit. But, it is definitely not avoidable. So I would kid around like Benjamin Franklin, in all his wisdom. I don't know if he originated this, but he said, this is to paraphrase, in life, you can only count on two things, death and taxes. Well, that's because he's a guy. Like, why didn't he say and menopause? So, there's nothing you can do as a woman to get out of that. And it is nature's way, and understanding what's happening and the process of ovarian aging and its ramifications throughout every organ system is really essential if we're going to deal effectively with all the consequences.
Absolutely. Well, and I'd love to know what your thoughts are, because we've done a really big deep dive into metabolic dysfunction here on the show, and knowing that 80% of adults are dealing with metabolic dysfunction. And I find that when you pair metabolic dysfunction, well, one, metabolic dysfunction is a big part of PCOS. But when you pair metabolic dysfunction with the loss of ovarian function, with estrogen and progesterone taking a nosedive, I find that things definitely can feel a lot worse. And so when you're speaking into what we can do in the process of really gearing up, like that bank account that we're saving for, so that post-menopause or menopause, I just call it menopause moving forward. It's just that point, but however you like to phrase it, in that conversation or in the research that you've looked at, definitely, I feel like in the research I've looked at, is if we can do a lot to support our metabolism, especially for our neurological function, we could have a little bit more ease and grace moving into menopause, because we can't stop the loss of estrogen and progesterone. That, like you said, it's inevitable. Like Benjamin Franklin should have known that that's the thing. But there are definitely other things that we can do to kind of support our bodies, so that maybe we don't feel that major cognitive shift. We don't feel those crazy mood swings, or we don't feel that memory or lack of alertness with our brain function, after we kind of enter into menopause and beyond.
So if you define metabolism, because everyone's talking about, metabolic health, metabolism, and people say, well, what the heck is metabolism anyway, right? So if you think of it as the critical essentials of life, the production, distribution, and utilization and storage of energy. So, like, what's the difference between someone who's alive and someone who is dead? Well, if we think about electrical activity in the heart, everyone's seen the TV shows where they're looking at the EKG and it's like doing its, and then it's like, so flatlining, right? For the brain, for the heart, no electrical activity. So in the brain, it's brain death. In the heart, it's death of the whole body, right? And that is loss of energy. So you think of the electrical activity, that's the energy of the heart, the energy of the brain. Well, most people don't know this, but the mitochondria, these little organelles in every cell that are the energy factory. So I think of them as sort of like the little fireplaces, that keep everything going. They're making the energy. So you have all these little mitochondria. And of course, the brain has the most, the heart, like the second.
I thought the ovaries had the most.
Well, the ovaries are very, very energy dependent too. It's hard to count them all. The brain, the heart, reproductive organs like the ovaries and so forth are very energy needing. You have to have energy. Nothing in the body is going to work well without energy. And estrogen, the form estradiol, is key to mitochondrial function. That is so often like one of the forgotten essentials of understanding these hormones, is that if you look at a picture of the mitochondria and you look at all the different aspects of what it's doing with the electron chain, the oxidative phosphorylation, the transfer of nutrients across the membrane, because you've got to have the pump that gets the long chain fatty acids and such into the mitochondria, the whole thing, the biogenesis, mitogenesis, creating new mitochondria, all essentially need estradiol. And estradiol plays a role in every part of mitochondrial function. Loss of estrogen from the ovaries translates into loss of the capability of creating adequate amounts of energy. So that will manifest in a host of ways throughout the body. Of course, in the brain, that is a big problem. If your brain doesn't make enough energy, it's not going to work properly. It doesn't do any good to have, like, you can eat and eat and eat, but if you can't transfer that food, which is an energy supply, into actually energy production, so it's like you live in a log cabin and it's in the middle of a snowstorm and you have one fireplace inside and you have tons of logs. I mean, you have no shortage of logs, like the equivalent of food. So there's no shortage of that, but your fireplace is broken, like you can't open the flue. So if you burn anything in it, you'll just die of smoke inhalation or you're burned down. So you can't create that energy. So you're freezing in this log cabin, even though you have plenty of fuel. So we often, as we age, in women after menopause and going through the transition, we have plenty of source of energy nowadays, not maybe in the past, but nowadays. So we have plenty of fuel, also known as food, but we can't turn it properly into energy to actually create the proper function of every organ system. And it's a different skill set to create fat storage and to burn fat. And so
Yes.
after menopause, we maintain the skill to make fat, but we lose the skill to properly burn fat. That's why after menopause, redistribution of body composition, and we end up with a lot more body fat, especially in the middle, the visceral fat, and muscle, which is huge. Also, all muscle is critical for maintaining glucose regulation, creation of energy. So muscle starts to decrease, along with bone starts to decrease. And these are really critical organs, not just for mobility, but also for energy regulation purposes. Talk about a big handicap after menopause. Without proper mitochondrial function, we have these problems. Now, giving hormones in menopause can definitely help. But right now, and I'm actually going to be talking to a researcher, it's fascinating, who's doing actually ovarian transplants and has actually done some transplants like from mice into chimpanzees and things. So maybe in the future, I don't think it's going to be for me, but in the future, we'll be able to clone ovaries and get, like, when we're 50, we get the equivalent of a 25-year-old set of ovaries. But right now, I don't have that capability to help any of my patients or myself that way. So even when I give hormones, it's not the same as being 25-year-old with those wonderful 25-year-old ovaries. So no matter what we do with hormone replacement therapy, that's not adequate. It's like, I consider it necessary, but not sufficient. So we have to pull every other tool out of our toolbox. So how can we essentially maintain metabolic function with mitochondria that are malfunctioning? Well, there are some tricks to the trade. And one of them actually is fasting. So it's really interesting how fasting has been shown to just put the body into this rejuvenating state, where you actually trigger autophagy, which is cellular rejuvenation, and you trigger bad cells, the ones that may go down the path towards cancer, these cells that are using up energy for no good benefit in the body and creating a lot of inflammation. These old senescent cells create a lot of inflammation, which underlies most of the degenerative diseases that we consider aging diseases, is this chronic state of inflammation. We can actually help to prevent or reduce this severity of a lot of this loss of mitochondrial function by helping the body to do what it can do the best with eating and sometimes not eating. So time-restricted eating and various forms of fasting can really help with mitochondrial function. And then when you combine it with adequate nutrition, because we want to always have our coenzymes. So there's like this whole group of enzymes, the sirtuins, that are involved with rejuvenation. And that's where the fasting comes in, that it helps to support and promote the production of the sirtuins. And that is an enzyme system, histone deacetylases, that go back, and they've done that in like worms and even earlier creatures than worms. So they can do, it's like what we call preserved in throughout the different evolutionary species of all kinds, is these sirtuins. And there's the special type, the SIRT3s, that are in mitochondria. And we can actually promotion of the growth and development of these enzymes and the functionality through these different types of fasting. And then estrogen, which is a very key component of this whole process. So without estrogen, it's also really necessary for sirtuins to work properly. And then you need the coenzyme, the NAD, which also is important to get from proper nutritional, to make sure you have all the B vitamins and niacin and so on, so that you can make NAD. But estrogen is a key part of this. That's part of the reason why without estrogen, you're not going to have proper rejuvenation of like autophagy. It requires having estrogen. So by giving this type of thing, you can help. And then another really key way to help mitochondria to stay functioning, have better metabolism, is through fitness and exercise. So that's like the all-purpose medicine is exercise. And it's been shown to also improve mitochondrial function and metabolism. So proper timed eating the right food, and having really great fitness and exercise, and then adding in physiologic hormones for people who want it. I don't force anything on anyone, but I personally love hormones because I understand them. I'm not afraid of them. I'm only afraid of endocrine disruptors. So, which is what, unfortunately, that type of thing is what's often studied and then assumed to be bioidentical hormones, which I'm sure you've covered that whole, understanding that you've got to talk about what you're actually talking about and study what you want to study, and then not make assumptions that something that you study is applicable to something you didn't study. So we want to make sure that we understand what the hormone is that's being studied, that it's a human hormone or if it's an endocrine
not
disruptor.
a horse hormone. Yeah, not a
right. Something that even the horse doesn't want.
Right, exactly.
So,
let me break it down really quickly. So we talk a lot about mitochondrial function and the hormesis and all the different ways to really stress mitochondrial, and then the cofactors, because to me, everything's about the mitochondria. So I love that. And we've broached the topic of estrogen and its role in mitochondria too on the show. But so that women know, one, we got to bolster up those mitochondria no matter what. I think that that's so critical, right? But then as we get older and heading into menopause, knowing that we're going to lose these really important precursors, these extremely critical. I always say that progesterone was the hormone you took for granted until it's gone, because you were like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that she was doing all of this, right? And then estrogen, I feel like she really lets you know what it's going to feel like when she's gone on the roller coaster ride down. But progesterone, she kind of quietly bows out, and then you start crying for her. And so that's kind of always how I feel it and see it as we move through this. But we lose estrogen, we lose progesterone. That's going to happen. And with that, if we didn't stack up our mitochondrial reserves, and we didn't help to bolster those, we didn't help to support the way in which that we are able to create energy in the body, right? Fuel isn't the issue. Are we actually transferring it over to energy? We lose estrogen. So the recommendation I know for you is, one, do the work on the metabolic front, right? Eat the healthy food, exercise, stress the system so that our mitochondria are happy, buzzing little fireplaces, doing the job of making more energy. But on the one hand, in order to kind of bolster us a little bit, you are recommending, basically estradiol and progesterone to just give us a little something for as long as possible to maintain a lot of the organ systems that are potentially degenerating because we're now in menopause.
I can never argue against the fact, which is an absolute fact, that menopause is natural, and which gets back to like, well, if every woman has it, and like, why? I mean, well, actually, most animal species, when their reproductive lifespan ends, so does the whole lifespan. So most creatures on Earth die when reproduction ends. A few animals, and humans are among them, will continue to live as females without reproductive capability. So nature designed women to have this sort of end time of in terms of reproduction, and it's logical. If you think of evolution, if you believe in evolution, which I do, but we, or however you want to think we got here, we are designed so that we are reproductively successful creatures. And that is the prime directive of life. Now, remember, humans are the only species on the planet that tries to control their reproductive destiny. No other animal does that. They don't say, this is not a good year to have a baby. I think I will not have sex. No, it doesn't work that way. Put any like rabbits together, dogs together, you're going to get little puppies and, we're just going to get them. So that's how it works. And in humans, we have changed the paradigm of thinking of reproduction, and we think of it as, an option you could just take or leave, like the fancy hubcaps or the, standard, no, but reproduction is embedded in our whole everything, including our metabolism. That's why you have to think of sex hormones as life hormones, and reproduction is not a tacked on little part. And so when reproduction ends, a lot of metabolic functions go into decline. We don't die because we also make estrogen in organs. That's how men get estrogen. They make it specifically in organs. We call that paracrine, and we make it from precursors, but men make a lot of their estrogen from testosterone. And we have, as we discussed, declining levels. So we don't have as much precursor to make the hormones, the estrogen from the precursors, because we don't have the precursors so much. So our estrogen levels are going to decline, not just from our ovarian ending or senescence, but also we can't make as much in the tissue. So we live the rest of our lives with a state of hormonal deficiency. And we're so amazing as humans, how adaptable we are to all kinds of adverse situations. Like when you see people living in really almost a starvation scenario, and yet they're still alive. We are the most adaptable creatures ever. That's why we're not extinct. But nature designed us to have a reproductive lifespan, and that's it. And that makes sense, because if women were having babies in their 60s, they probably have like a mortality rate that was through the roof. They wouldn't be alive long enough to raise their children to their reproductive maturity, because, obviously now people live to be much older, but, if you go back in time, there weren't a whole lot of women living and raising little kids when they were 70. That's not, they were raising sometimes grandkids. And, we have that whole grandmother hypothesis and so on that allows us to live another dozen years after reproduction ends to help raise the grandkids. But we're not designed to go on forever, but we've adapted with better food and environment, sanitation, that we can live longer, but we don't always live better. So once we accept that nature designed us to have a reproductive lifespan, and when it ends, and it's supposed to end, and because our eggs are all gone, we females are born with a set number. And I mean, there's some question about can you make new eggs or not, but we're not going to make a whole bunch, even if we make any new ones. And so we're born pretty much with our full set of eggs. And when they're gone, and they're designed to be used up at a certain point. And then we have to fend for ourselves. So understanding that, then we can sort of just accept menopause as natural. But in medicine, like I'm a doctor, I'm an MD, there's nothing that is natural that is beyond my desire to modify. So, I mean, that is what we do. I mean, like think of cosmetic dentistry, we do modify nature when we don't like it. I mean, that's what MDs do. So we give you artificial joints when your own ones wear out, artificial limbs if you're in a car accident. I mean, amazing things that we can do, right? None of which is natural because we don't like what natural has happened or what's interfered with natural, whether it's illness or accidents or aging. So to me, the fact that our ovaries have a natural lifespan, and then after that, we go into sort of a metabolic decline state, so I don't care that it's natural. I mean, the people argue well, it's natural. Menopause is supposed to be natural. Your hormones are supposed to go away. And it's yeah, so I don't like gray hair. I don't like wrinkles. So I don't have a problem addressing the natural question, but some people do. So I'm it's okay. So I try to bend natural to what I want. So like, I'm not going to recreate food. We already tried that. That didn't work, right?
Mhm.
So, you want to give hormones as well to be mimicking as close as possible what's optimal for the body. So even when you go against nature, you want to go with nature, right? Because everything that's so-called age management or anti-aging is going against nature, but that's okay because we're having higher quality life and we're a whole lot cheaper for the healthcare system too,
Yes, absolutely.
And so, I want to give hormones to be more physiologic. I only want to give hormones that are naturally in the human body, the kind that nature gave us from our ovaries. I want to replace it because some smart people figured out how we can do that and I can utilize it. So I want to mimic nature as much as possible. And that means, the rhythms are circadian rhythms and our lunar rhythms. So we want to recreate the environment in every cell that allows the cell to function at an optimal level. Because I always say, well, a cell doesn't really think I'm old. The cell just does what it's genetically programmed to do. So if we can maintain the proper milieu of a younger person with the proper nutritional status, hormones, and all the rhythms that we're born with to make sure our clock genes are all working on cue, so all our organs are working in the same time zone, in the same synchrony, because that's sort of part of menopause, is because our clock genes and our master clock are all programmed through estrogen to some degree.
What you mean by that is by when we get back, if we were to get back on hormones in menopause, maybe even in perimenopause, to keep them within the cycle that our bodies would have normally have run.
That would be the best. Now, I'm actually part of a study that's just beginning now that is going to look at replacing hormones in a physiologic way to mimic a menstrual cycle. We don't have good data on that. We have,
Yeah,
anecdotal data.
so.
We just anecdotal data. So we're trying to start a study. So what I recommend is giving levels of bioidentical human estradiol to try to achieve a sort of a reasonable level. Not the idea that came out after the Women's Health Initiative was the lowest dose. Well, I don't go for the lowest dose. I go for the most effective dose. Why would I give the lowest dose of vegetables that you could survive with? I want to give what's optimal. So I want to give the optimal dose. So that would be something that a woman would maybe have like during her luteal phase, not the lowest, not the highest, but something sort of in the mid range. And then I want to give progesterone to give it in a pulsed way, because the human body, the female body, doesn't make the same amount of progesterone every day of the cycle. It only makes it in the luteal phase. So at least that much I can do. I can give just like essentially recreate a luteal phase. So I give the estrogen and physiologic levels, I give the progesterone to be pulsed. And then, most women will have a bleed. So it's not fertility. I wish I could do that. I can't bring back fertility by giving hormones, but I'm giving back the period. Now, I just tell women, they say, oh, women hate having periods because that's the best thing about menopause. And I say, well, think about it this way. That's how you're created, is to have a period. And it's a sign that not only are you shedding the lining of the uterus, but bad cells elsewhere in the body. And we know that there's think of it as a catharsis, and your body is like going through this cycle, and it's good for you. And when you give the period in the menopause, you're not going to give like heavy cramps and heavy bleeding. I mean, it's not recreating the worst period on the planet. That's not what it's doing, because it's not really a period. It's a withdrawal bleed. So the menstrual cycle, we always talk about, it's a vital sign. If your period is horrible, that means there's a problem. So, but we're not recreating that when we give bleeding with the hormones in the menopause. It's very mild. Any woman can deal with it.
So for how long have you been able, in your own personal practice, have been able to keep women on hormone therapy to help, again, boost metabolic function? As you mentioned before, I think one of the biggest highlights of this conversation, I hope women walk away with, as we talked about mitochondria being the most robust in the brain, the ovaries, and the heart. And I'm going to argue that there's still the most in the ovaries, only because I just think that is so cool if women had the most mitochondria in the ovaries relative to men and women. I just love that idea, but that it is a metabolic process. Like, you can't have reproduction without metabolism. And so, as you can imagine, the bow out of that reproductive system is the bow out of the whole system, no matter how you slice it. How long is recommended, or have you seen women are able to stay on hormones to kind of maintain some of that?
Well, happily, I don't have to be like under wraps any longer because, like, because I've always promoted lifetime because like, when do you want to be in a state of deficiency? I mean, never. So, but fortunately, because we always like, as MDs, like to go with something that's considered so-called standard of care. So in 2017, a big, conservative mainstream organization, the North American Menopause Society, NAMS, they came out with a new position statement on hormones. And it was obviously when you read it that there were two different schools of thought because they came out with like something of like a mishmash of opinions. But one of the key opinions that did come out in that position statement was that you can prescribe for the life of the woman forever. You can give hormones for the following 3 reasons. And I bow down to them for coming up with this. And I just can't even imagine all the infighting that must have happened before this came out. But in the end, they said lifetime hormones for treatment of symptoms, that would be traditionally nights, hot flashes, night sweats, and so on, for bone health, because that's the only other FDA approved use, and for quality of life. So, I mean, quality of life is everything, right? So basically, mood and sleep and energy and pain reduction and body composition, everything that goes into being a happy, healthy female is quality of life. So I now have, a rubber stamp, you're okay to give hormones for life from the North American Menopause Society, which is worldwide recognized as an authority on menopause. Take it or leave it, whatever you think, but they are recognized as such. And so now I have the green light to give hormones forever. And they did say under medical supervision, so it's not a do-it-yourselfer, but it's definitely now okayed officially that I can give hormones forever for the life of the woman. And that I have women in their 90s now on hormones, and they're like my most amazing patients ever, and I just love it. And I think that everyone should be aware that this is actually a viable option, that this old idea that when you hit 60 and for sure 65, that you should just get off. You're too old. You've probably heard this expression, you're too old to be on hormones. It's like, give me a break. No, you're not. You will get a break because over 50% of women have osteoporotic fractures. So you do not want to give up something that is beneficial for no good reason other than some ridiculous, archaic view of hormones based on the Women's Health Initiative. So please, eradicate all those crazy views and see hormones for what they are: messengers of vital information to the cell to help the cell to do what it needs to do to optimally function. It's as simple as that. Now, on a cellular level, it gets really complex, but when you just think of the basic purpose of a hormone, it's to give information so that the cell will know what to do, what enzyme to make, what protein to make, what kinase to make, so that the cell will do what it should do so that you can be a healthy, happy woman. So don't give that up for no good reason other than people who are still living with all ideas, like the earth isn't flat, hormones don't kill. I mean, let's get over it.
I love it. I so appreciate this conversation. And I so appreciate that you have put this in a book as well. And we get to have this conversation. Dr. Felice Gersh, where is the book? I take it it's on Amazon. Is it out now?
It is out. It just came out in the last couple of weeks. And so it is available on Amazon, and it's gotten rave reviews. So I'm very, very proud of it. And it's really, I would call it the foundational guide to what every woman can face in menopause at every stage. So I broke menopause down into 3 stages. It's somewhat arbitrary, like the 10 years preceding the end of cycle, the first 10 years of menopause, and then the next how many decades thereafter, because there is some variation in what each stage of menopause encompasses as far as different medical problems and symptoms. So I always say the first step is to define the problem. You will never solve a problem if you haven't even defined what the problem is. So basically, this book is defining menopause, what it is, the different problems throughout the body, and then it also gives a quick guide for each and every one of the 50 things that I discuss, what you can do about it. And so it's like almost like a reference book that you can look up the different problems that women face at different stages of their menopausal journey, and then what you can do about it.
Love it. I just want to say thank you so much for doing the work and diving into the research and putting it together. And because as you mentioned, up until literally less than a decade ago, we were mandated to actually look at women's bodies, research women's bodies. And so having to take all that information and kind of piece it together and really be able to come up with an integrative plan for women is what you do best. And so I was just so grateful to have you on the show. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Oh, let me just mention the name of my book.
Oh, yes, yes.
Oh, it's like a little, so it's called Menopause, 50 Things You Need to Know.
Perfect.
And it's my pleasure. I thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss a topic that both you and I are passionate about.